I think we might as well kick off. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a Decker Chambers discussion for International Women's Day about what it's like being a woman in the legal sector. We're going to be reflecting on the very significant advances made by women in recent years, while also pondering the problems which still disproportionately affect women. I'm Susanna Bennett, a barrister practicing in clinical negligence and personal injury. I'm joined today by Louise McCulloch, who specialises in crime and professional discipline, Laura Elfield, who is a general civil practitioner, Patricia Londono, who practices in financial crime and regulatory work, among other things, having previously had a career in academia, and Irene Sriharan, who practices in family law and human rights. If you've got any questions which come to you during the talk, then please put them in the question and answer box, which is at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and cover as many of them as we can at the end of the talk. Before we start, I've got a few statistics for us to consider about women at the bar in particular. The proportion of male to female pupils to start with is quite encouraging. It's been pretty much equal for a number of years. In fact, according to a Bar Standards Board report last year, there have been slightly more female than male pupils every year since 2015. In the most recent round of pupillage applications made through Pupillage Gateway, there were slightly more successful applications made by women, and a greater percentage of applications made by women were successful, so 9.8% as opposed to 9.4%. Whereas the year before, men had a somewhat higher success rate per application, with 8.8% of men's applications succeeding compared to 7.1% of women. In the early 90s, so 30 years ago now, about 40% of pupils were women. So you can see just how far things have improved in the last 30 years or so. When we look at the bar as a whole, the picture is somewhat less rosy. Most up-to-date figures we have from the Bar Standards Board reveal that across the entire bar, excluding non-responses to this question, about 39.3% of barristers identify as female and 60.7% identify as male. So in other words, just under 2 in 5 barristers are women. That is partly a consequence of the fact that 20 years ago and more, there were far fewer women entering the bar than there are today. And so the increasing numbers of women are kind of gradually increasing as the profession gets older. It's also partly because of problems retaining women at the bar. We know that women are more likely to leave the professions, and one of the reasons for this is that they're more likely to have childcare responsibilities, and it can be difficult to balance those with a career at the bar. Nonetheless, over the last few years, the problem has reduced to some extent. 30 years ago, the average age for a woman leaving the bar permanently was 37, and it was 48 for men. Between 2015 and 2020, it's been 48 for women and 57 for men. So the gap between the ages when men and women leave the bar has shrunk slightly, and both men and women leaving the bar tend to do so at a later stage than they used to. In terms of silks, unfortunately, men still significantly outnumber women. The most recent figures I have are that 18% of silks are female. For most of the last 30 years, interestingly, applications by female barristers for silk have been more likely to succeed than those by male barristers, although far more applications have been made by male barristers. I speculate that is probably because female barristers may be more reluctant to apply unless they think they've got a good chance of succeeding, meaning that a greater percentage of applications by women succeed. In the most recent round of silk applications, 38% of successful applicants were female. That's down from 46% the year before. One of those was our very own fabulous Sarah Prager, who is an absolutely excellent practitioner. And the year before that, there was Laura Johnson taking silk as the first female silk in chambers. Finally, another question which is often asked about women at the bar is about the gender pay gap. the Bar Council has recently collated earnings data from Bar Mutual. And what that shows is that actually the gap between male and female earnings at the bar has increased rather than decreased over the last 20 years. But what it doesn't take into account is seniority. So the increasing gap between what male and female barristers earn can be explained by the growing proportion of female barristers at the junior end. In other words, from the data that we have, it's very hard to know the extent of the gender pay gap. I speculate that there probably is quite a significant gender pay gap at the bar, but it's simply very difficult to get hold of the figures and know for sure. So that's a whistle-stop tour through the most recent up-to-date statistics for women at the bar. And now I want to turn to our panelists with a few questions arising. And I'm going to start with Laura. And I want to come back to the question about retention of women. Are you surprised to hear that there is an ongoing problem across the bar with retaining women, especially as they become more senior?
No, I'm not at all. I've been doing the job for, I'm now 27 years core, which I had to double count just before starting today. I think there are a few issues. One is obviously the childcare issue and whether or not women are in chambers which are committed to the business case for retention. I think second, those figures that you give about the gender pay gap, they are demoralising. And I think there is an extent to which, and I think it's less than it used to be, women simply stop. When I started, I would often be the only woman in the room. We'd only just been allowed to start wearing trousers as women at the bar. I would be carrying out equality and diversity training quite often to a hostile room. And it would be exhausting. So I think quite apart from the retention issues in terms of childcare and other caring responsibilities, we are still, to a certain extent, in a pale male, stale world. And I think that must account to some extent for the lack of retention. It's changing and it's so much better than it used to be. And we can talk about why that is. But certainly if you ask why there's a retention issue, those would be the things that I mostly identify.
Thank you. Louise, I wanted to get your thoughts on the same question. Are you at all surprised at this continuing issue with retaining women?
No, I'm not. And I also think that it's kind of a positive. I mean, it's not positive for the statistics, but you know what? If a woman thinks, I really don't need to put up with this anymore, and transfer to a different half of the sector or do something different, that's actually quite an empowering thing, I think, in some respects. So, I mean, good grief, many a time I've thought I've really had enough, but I have stuck at it and I've come through the other side. But I also think if people feel that their skills are better deployed elsewhere, well, good, absolutely good on them. And I would support that. So yeah, I don't know if that's
that's interesting
answer, but thank you.
And do you feel as though problems with sexism at the bar, some of which Laura alluded to, have got better over the last, however many years?
Well, I'm in two minds about it. I mean, certainly my place at the table is more secure, now than perhaps it would have been 30 years ago. But you are still subject to misogyny, some of it very subtle, even from people who should know better. And sometimes clients don't really want a woman. I know we've got protected characteristics, they shouldn't discriminate. But if a client says he wants a man on a heavy-duty case, then I'm afraid, for the best will in the world, that case will go to someone that the client would rather have. So it's all over the place, really. And I also think sometimes women aren't as supportive of each other's career progression as they should be. But we're not anywhere near where we need to be. But my God, we are a whole lot better than we were. The direction of travel is good. We just need to keep supporting each other.
We're so much further forward because I've done the equality and diversity training for a number of years. I'm no longer on the equality and diversity committee after sort of 15 years work on it. And I mean, now when I come to these training sessions, I mean, the question arises always, what happens if someone rings up and they say they want a man for this case, or indeed a woman for this case, because I do a lot of clinical negligence mesh work, and a lot of people say, I want a woman for this case. The clerks are now trained, and that was not the case before, to say, well, why? What are you looking for in particular? And they are trained to give a range of names of different sexes, and then leave it to the client. Now, whether or not that changes the ultimate outcome, what has surprised me in recent years is I come along to the training when I ask the question, what do you do if? And the clerks volunteer it. In fact, I would say that the junior clerks come, clued up about all of this before I have to tell them. So I think that's a really big change and a really positive one. And of course, we've got a few women in the clerks' room now as well.
Yeah, thank goodness.
That's too.
That's very encouraging. And is it fair to say that sexism is coming more from society generally, whereas it used to be sort of ingrained in the bar, and possibly, not necessarily, but possibly like ingrained in different chambers and the way inns were run and the way everything worked, whereas now the sort of problems Louise was mentioning about clients wanting a male barrister, it's sort of, there's nothing that chambers can do about that, obviously. They have to deal with it as best they can. But is that one way of looking at it, that possibly chambers isn't the problem so much as it used to be?
I would say 100%. I mean, chambers used to be very not very nice places for women, and they used to be quite mean to the female clerks back in the day. And as Laura said, the fact that we've got some wonderful women in our clerks' room is really a hopeful sign for the future, and they are so good at their job. But of course, that raises the issue that as a woman, we either feel or we're made to feel that we have to be twice as good to be thought equal to, I'm doing a case at the minute, and hopefully nobody involved in the case is on the call, but some of the men are so very lazy on the case. Things haven't been read or prepared or done, or assumptions are made which aren't correct, and yet I'm working all hours to make sure, because I know that if I don't deliver, there'll be some negative connotation to the fact that the woman didn't do a very good job, whereas the men can do absolutely diddly days on days. And it doesn't seem to really affect their reputation.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that there's still, the inherent sort of authority gap. If it's not said in a loud, deep, booming male voice, is it as important? But I mean, again, we overcome that by working twice as hard and being over prepared often. But again, it's less of a problem than it used to be. Certainly, if I look back at some of my early cases where I would stand there and I'd be doing personal injury claim, and there'd be cross-examination about care, and I'd have my male opponent and male judge saying, well, my wife's the same. Oh yes, the amount of cleaning my wife does. Oh yes, we know what women are like. And I mean, that would not, I believe, I've not had it in a very long time, and I don't think that would fly anymore. So there are changes, but there's still this authority gap that we face.
Okay, fine. Moving on to a slightly different topic. In the past, women have often found it difficult to return to a career at the bar after having children. Partly that's because they haven't been supported in doing so, and partly it's because they've often borne the brunt of childcare responsibilities, with men tending to go back to work full-time and women tending to stop work. Laura, can you tell us a bit about your own experience of returning to the bar after having a child?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very lucky. I mean, I did it late. I had my child very late in the day, not intentionally, but that's the way it worked out. And I think it's interesting because for those watching. We had this discussion last week, didn't we, all of us? And either there was me coming to motherhood late in the day, or others had their child and then came to the bar. But certainly there's that juggle that's gone on. I was extremely lucky. I was established, and I had real support from male heads of chambers. But I was off for 12 months plus. And when I got to the 12-month point, I was convinced I wasn't coming back. I just wasn't ready. And again, this is, in many ways, we're extremely lucky. If I was employed, I wouldn't have this luxury. But at the time, we had a policy that, our written policy was that women would be suspended from chambers if they didn't come back after 12 months, which is startling considering we're all self-employed. And I came into chambers to meet with the then head of chambers with my baby and said, I'm not coming back. Are you going to suspend me? I'm not ready to come back yet, and I don't quite know when I'm ready. And he said, "That's so ridiculous. Is that in our policy? Well, that needs to come out." And he was hugely supportive. What would be fair in terms of rent? What would best work for you? Shall we review this in 6 months' time? And as a result of that discussion, and in fact bringing to his attention that in our policy there was a suspension of women at 12 months, we totally rewrote the policy, and lots of women chipped in as to what would be fair and beneficial. And obviously we have to weigh that against, we are a business, so we have to keep ourselves running. But it was amazing for me. And in fact, when I came out of that meeting with the head of chambers, the former head of chambers, also male, was waiting sort of nearby, and he said, well, I was there, and if he was going to suspend you, I was going to come rushing in and make sure it didn't happen. So I was very supported to come back. And for me, it was really another 4 months made all the difference. I was ready 4 months later. I came back part-time only for a couple of years. But, if at 12 months I'd been told leave or leave your baby at home, I would have left the bar. So I think I have found that a commitment to retention has really, really benefited. And I feel extremely lucky to be here. And I do civil work. I do personal injury and clinical negligence work. It's pretty friendly to balancing work and childcare commitments in a way that crime and family, which is much more core heavy, isn't.
Because I was thinking, we sometimes have this impression of barristers running off to court here, there and everywhere every day. And has it been a challenge sort of juggling court commitments and paperwork commitments with a young child at the same time?
I think probably I'd turn to the criminal and family practitioners to talk about that. I mean, for me, there's been a little bit of that, but personal injury and clinical negligence work, you're very rarely in a long trial. I mean, it does happen, but most of the work settles, and you're doing conferences, and you're doing CCMCs, and you're doing interim hearings, much of which is now remote. So the change in the way we all work since COVID has actually been quite conducive to balancing work and family commitments. And again, doing it slightly later and when I was more established, and has allowed me, I think, to have the confidence to say to my solicitors, can we have the conference at 1 o'clock so that I can be finished at 4, rather than feeling that, I must say yes to every 5 o'clock conference. For my solicitors out there, of course, I will still have a conference for you at 5 o'clock if you want me to, but that, yes, I mean, the flexibility for me, but I have a particular practice, has been very conducive to the juggle.
Yeah, and of course, women are often also more likely to have caring responsibilities more generally, not just for children. Anyone else, Irene, Patricia, or Louise, have either of you had particular caring responsibilities which have sort of either made it challenging or which you've been able to work through in doing this job?
Happy to pipe in. So my story is slightly different in the sense that I decided to put off coming to the bar until my child, who's now all grown up, was older. I'd went to university a bit later. I was in my mid to late 20s when I went to university, and I graduated in 2001. And I always knew that I wanted to go to the bar, but at that stage my son was still quite young. And I'd heard, especially the line of work that I suspected I wanted to go into, which was going to be very court heavy, i.e. crime. And I'd heard at that stage that the bar was hard going in terms of balancing family life. And at that stage I was a single mother. And so I decided instead of going to the bar straight away, that I'd stay behind in academia. And I was able to use that experience in a way that actually ended up helping me in the longer term, because I thought, well, I can get some more qualifications, and I enjoyed actually the discipline of studying law as a subject. I enjoyed that immensely. So in some ways it worked, and of course was much more family friendly. And so by the time that my son was older and I was ready to come to the bar, I didn't have to deal with that issue in particular. I had to deal with coming to the bar later, but I'd kind of adapted my professional life in terms of my entry to the bar because of my childcare responsibilities. It's meant that now I don't have them, and I'm slightly freer, but that's how I dealt with it, which was to hold fire and come later on.
And what are the challenges that you faced in coming later, and what are the advantages?
So if I go with the advantages first, I think if you come to the bar, or I suppose any career later, it feels like you've made, and I'm not suggesting that someone who doesn't come later hasn't made an informed decision, but it felt like because I'd done something else, I was doubly committed to it, because I just thought, yeah, I'm sure now that this is what I want to do. And so it meant, I think, that I was, and I had gone to bar school, and the statistics for people getting pupillage at bar school were not great. I mean, it was a small number. And I didn't let that put me off. And I think that part of that was because I was coming later, and I just did feel, no, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. And I just, I persevered with it. And I think also once there, it just felt as if I had a different approach than perhaps I would have done, if I'd been doing this when I was younger. Speaking for myself, I think I would have been, found it much more heavy going. I had different challenges in terms of heavy going, which we might come on to later, but I think at that stage it had given me a resolve. The disadvantages, of course, is that you're changing career. So if you're kind of midway through your life, as it were, you're going from academia, which is a nicely regularly paying job. This was my experience, to a career that, at least to start off with, is very unstable financially. And so that was hard going, because I wasn't I was an older woman. I had to live somewhere where my stepson could come home, so I couldn't share a flat. And so there were these kinds of considerations that made it more complicated. And I think also one of the things that I found, and this was certainly how I perceived it, was that there's a hierarchy, and it's on year of call. And I was showing up as someone who was relatively recently called, but looked older. And I think that might have been slightly confusing for perhaps people who'd been fairly traditional practitioners. But on the whole, I think that served me well. I think I ended up being able to use that time in a way that actually really helped me in the long term, notwithstanding the short-term challenges that I faced as someone.
And your initial career sounds like it was really interesting and thought-provoking in its own way.
Yeah, I developed an interest when I was at university. So this was I graduated from my first degree in 2001. And I developed, and it was, being discussed because it was around the time that the Human Rights Act came in, and I developed a massive interest in that and was able to go on and do research on that subject with, with very much a gender perspective in mind, which was a subject that really interested me. So I was able to spend that time doing something that I was really interested in as a discipline, which was, and was able to, make a go of it. Although I had to, when I was doing pupillage interviews, I had to come up with a good answer as to why now.
I bet, yeah.
That was a question that I was asked a lot, and I'm not even sure that I remember the answer, but I remember having to think of a very carefully formulated response to that question.
Do you think being a woman made it more difficult for you changing careers at that sort of stage?
In the sense that I felt, and I don't recall the exact response that I gave, but I remember thinking that I didn't want to go into interviews talking about my childcare commitments, because I perceived, rightly or wrongly, that probably wouldn't be very helpful. And so that dilemma, I suspect, a man wouldn't have had. So yes, that part of it just made it difficult. It felt like there were things that I felt as if I couldn't raise because, I perceived that whoever was the receiving end of it would interpret it in a particular way. That was the main issue that I felt that I was coming up against.
And Irene, I know that you came to the bar a bit later. Can you tell us a bit about your story?
I did, yes. And it's really interesting, just picking up on what Patricia said about speaking up. I was thinking whilst everyone was talking, well, I don't have children. And we just got married with sort of COVID wedding we had. And so I think back now at the beginning of our relationship, and both my husband and I are both barristers. So there were times where we hardly ever saw each other. And really all it needed was a few words just saying, actually, it's just the work-life balance in general. I need to take some time off. Like, this is affecting my relationship, or I have to go and care for my parents because my parents are a bit older. And, if it's left to myself and my brother, it's usually myself that ends up going there and taking them to hospital appointments, etc. And I just remember having a light bulb moment when my husband and I were both in a conference room. Not my husband now, at the time we weren't together, we weren't married, but he just said to me, "Oh gosh, like this is." We looked at our diaries and we were having to schedule like our next date, as it were, about a week later. And he said, "Oh, I'm just going to call my clerks and tell them." And I didn't, it hadn't even occurred to me that I would do that. And he picked up the phone without even thinking, and he called his clerks. He said, "Oh no, I can't do that. Like, this is really affecting my life now. And actually, can you give me a couple of days where I'm actually in London? I'm not traveling out," because he was doing crime at the time as well. And I remember thinking of that as such an alien concept. And now, a few, 4 or 5 years later, and especially at DECA, our clerks are great at that. I mean, I've just joined in January and already, and I've had to say, "Oh, I've got to take my mum to a doctor's appointment." Our clerks are great at just moving things. But, as recently as 4 or 5 years later, I probably wouldn't have had the guts to do that, because I would have thought that was just, I don't want to seem like I'm just whinging about something. So to go back to your question, I think I joined the bar late. I was, I think, 35 when I went to bar school. And part of that was because I was off doing other things. I was in DC, I was on the first Obama campaign, and, I thought I was all about going into sort of political advocacy and that sort of thing. By the time I decided I wanted to get into law, I think the issues I had was I had a lot of feedback from people saying, "Well, it's really hard to get in. You're a female, you're a woman of colour. The bar is historically white male institution. It's archaic. It's going to be really difficult for you." And so I think for a while I thought I went through the first few sort of stages of thinking, well, maybe it's not for me. And then I think, you know, I told you all when we had the last week when we had a chat, you know, I went and did a panel talk for as Sri Lankan lawyers, because I'm originally from Sri Lanka. And so I joined this organization. I thought this would be really helpful. And they asked me to do a panel, lots of young people asking us what we wanted to do and what bits of area of law we wanted to get into, etc. And when I said that I wanted to be a barrister, the amount of pushback that I got in the question and answers part of it, you know, so many people were saying to me, it's really difficult to get in, and giving me all the horror stories. And so that's what made me take some time. I thought, right, I need to really build my CV. I need to make sure I have lots of other things on there. As it turns out, I have to say, I have found being a woman of colour, it's not been an issue as such. It's not an overt thing that I have had anyone say anything. I haven't had obstacles in that way. But what I do think is that it's really important that we are all alive to the fact that the younger people who are trying to get into the bar probably feel like that this is the picture of the bar. You know, even if you watch it on television, it's all, I'm showing my age here, but, you know, it's a bit sort of Rumpole of the Bailey and Kavanaugh Kesey, and it's always, you know, barristers are always portrayed as older, white, male. And so perhaps that's the image that people have within my community. Especially, it took quite a long time for me to have the strength to think, no, I'm going to do it. I will do it. And I have to say, I've had lots of people support me, and I'm really supportive of young junior barristers or bar course students getting involved with the Inns, because the minute you walk in there and voice your apprehension about anything, there's always lots of people to help and lots of organisations. I mean, I was president of the Middle Temple Students Association when I was a student, and to think that, you know, I was at a table, because as the president you get to sit on the executive committee and go to the meetings, and I was sitting at the table with, you know, high court judges and now Supreme Court judges and people at the bar who 5 years before that, just as I was starting out, I would have thought there's no way I'd be allowed through these doors, or there's a block. So I do think, on a positive note, it has been really, really, I feel like the bar is a supportive place, and the Inns are where you get a lot of support. And Chambers, of course, is great as well. But I think there does have to be a lot of work now, I think, with people going out to schools and talking to young people and going to certain areas in London, for instance, and saying, you know what, there isn't a set way that the bar looks. You know, I was on a care case last week, 5-day hearing. The judge was female and she was English, and there were 3 Asian female barristers, and there was 1 Afro-Caribbean barrister, and, you know, it was just a mixed room. And so I think the idea that a barrister looks like a certain way needs to be dispelled with the younger people. And I think with our own communities as well, as I said, I think a lot of Asian people that I came across, a lot of people in my family, my extended family members, were just saying, oh, it's so hard to get into the bar. It's such a small group. It's a clique. You know, so I think that's probably why I ended up doing all these different things, and thinking I had to flesh out my CV a bit, which wasn't a bad thing at all. And it's always a good thing to do that. But I did also face some challenges in feeling like I was a little bit older, and yet feeling like, you know, being a pupil at 38 or 39 is tough. And I think that's what I would say about that. In terms of being a woman in court, I have to say that some of my worst days in court have been with female judges. So it's also, I think, really important that we are really, you know, we're good to each other. And I think it's much better now than when I first started. And that was only, you know, it's even just in the last 5 years I see a difference. But it's really important that we all sort of are nice to each other and nicer to each other. There can be, I think, the element of, you know, I've had it tough, so I'm going to toughen you up. It's not, you know, I don't think any of it is said or done in a malicious way, but I have been in court where I've had a judge be really, really horrible to me. And I've heard male barristers afterwards being like, oh, she's a bit nicer to the boys. And I've heard it. I've heard that happen. I've heard it. So, it's one of those things.
Yeah, sort of a bizarre feature of psychology, isn't it? Sort of female judges being extra horrible to female barristers. I should say it's not true across the board. It's only occasionally, but I've also had that experience.
With male judges too.
Yes, exactly. I've had that with male judges as well.
Yeah.
Irene was touching upon well-being and how important that is, and how it's become more to the forefront of being a barrister, and it's been recognised just how important it is. Louise, do you want to tell us a little bit about the sort of well-being initiatives we've got going on in Chambers?
Yes. Well, I probably, because I've been so busy, I probably haven't accessed them all. But we have a wonderful support network. We have because, of course, since COVID in particular, people work remotely so much more. There are days in the month of Thursday, which could be on a Tuesday, when we gather and have a chat. We've got some fantastic bakers, well, one particular fantastic baker in Chambers, but I really do think that people. I think about DECA because I only joined it in just before the merger in September. On the whole, take the work very seriously, but they don't take themselves very seriously. So you can have some really good casual chats with your colleagues in Chambers and feel 100% better than you were before you had a chat with them. The clerks are great. I remember one of the people from Chancery Lane, it might have been you actually, or somebody saying that the clerk would look at the diary and say, is there something in your diary that I cannot see that I need to take account of when booking a conference and things like this? So, real emotional intelligence, and that's what you need. And just on well-being generally, you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't, even warriors fighting in an army need to have rest and need to have, recoup their energy and resources. So I was very fortunate to be at the entry point of wellbeing at the bar. Rachel Spearing, who's a venture in a temple, set it up because one of her colleagues took his own life, and it was simply because the pressure built up too much. And we push ourselves too hard. So we do need to take care of ourselves. We need to take care of each other, and we need to have, as we do at DECA, wellbeing initiatives. And it's ironic that when it started out, people were like, oh, we don't need that sort of thing. Well, I'm perfectly all right. And it's always the people who are not perfectly all right who think they don't need it. So it really has been a matter of progress. But I realise I'll be a bit of a fraud to talk about all the wellbeing initiatives in Chambers because I haven't fully accessed them. But we do have emotional intelligence alive and well, and stalking the 3 floors at 5 Lawrence Street.
I mean, just the fact that there can be a wellbeing committee without it being a laughing point is huge progress. That it's taken very seriously, and people no longer boast about having no work-life balance. Or if they do, that's not seen as a boast that anyone wants to. I'm losing my words here, but yes, it's not saying that anyone wants to aspire to. I mean, the Wellbeing Committee. Yes, it's drinks in Chambers once a month, but it's also an open door, isn't it? If people are having issues, there is someone there. And in addition, we have an Equality and Diversity Committee. And, that is, again, an open door if you're having an equality or diversity issue. But it's also going out and providing training. And I understand that we are now, although I've been hearing about this for a long time, but we are apparently now on the cusp of properly reviewing the gender pay gap, which exists in Chambers as much as it exists elsewhere. So progress, and progress, just the fact that we can talk about well-being.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And we've got a mentoring scheme as well, as I understand it, whereby anyone who is junior, and indeed people who are senior, can get a mentor, and then they've got a particular person they can talk to in chambers to help them with their work, or talk to more generally about work-life balance. One,
can I just say that this I think this issue of perception is really important, because Patricia, it saddened me to hear that you felt that you couldn't apply to the chambers because you'd have to talk about your childcare responsibilities at interview, and certainly on any interview panels that I've been reviewing or looking at the questions for in my time as involved in equality and diversity, you can't ask those questions. I'm sure there are chambers out there that ask those questions still, but it's, again, that's a perception issue, and I think if we want to attract more diversity to the bar, more women, more diversity in general, it's about getting out there to the schools.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, our school's too late, right? Because people have already selected themselves out by that point.
Yeah.
And one topic which used to be very taboo, but thankfully is less so today, is women's experience of menopause. And Patricia, I wonder if you wanted to talk a tiny bit about how that was for you and how you managed being a barrister around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I know that the Bar Council has now produced a document about supporting women in the menopause, and I think part of the advantages of being a barrister is that you become very self-reliant, and so I recall going through that experience and really not wanting to talk to anybody about it. But I remember thinking, in the days when I kind of would get up and I hadn't slept very well because I'd been woken in the night. My brain, my memory was just shot, and it wasn't a fraction of what it used to be 10 years ago, as well as myriad other symptoms, thinking, gosh, I'm glad I don't have to go in front of a jury today. And part of the reason for that is that I managed to get myself involved in inquiry work, which just meant that I could do a lot of work from home, or I could go into an office to work, and I could leave at a sensible hour, and it felt far less pressured. But I can recall at the time actually not wanting to discuss it with any, especially not wanting to discuss it with the clerks. And part of that, and I wasn't at this chambers at that time, but it was to do with how I perceived it would be received, because so much of the kind of derogatory language around women can be, hormone based. And I just thought, I don't want to give people ammunition to think that I'm unstable or something and that I can't do my job. So I kept it to myself. But one of the advantages, I think, of having come to the bar now is that there were women who were very senior in chambers, and I felt as if I could talk to them about it. Now, I would imagine that 20 years ago there were far fewer senior women in chambers, and I just think that ability to have someone senior to talk to about things like that was invaluable. I know that there are now moves to be more supportive of women, which I think is all good, and to just be more open about it. But yeah, I felt when I was going through it, I was suffering from this idea that I mustn't tell anybody about it because I didn't want to play into people's stereotypes about women, Anyway, so that was my experience. I hope other people's experience has been a bit more kind of they felt as if they were able to be more open about it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I think people are more and more open about it, and absolutely they should be. Yeah. But there are still prejudices, and that fully explains why you didn't want to be 100% open about it.
I can't imagine now saying to the clerks, "Oh, I've been up all night, having a bit of a sweat and having a." We are educating and spreading the word, but there's at present, I don't think we're quite where we would like to be with it.
This is where women in the clerks room as well is just so important, I think. Again, when I was thinking about the bar and I was doing many pupilages here and there. So we're going back now probably about 10 years. Even as recently as that, even the clerks rooms, clerking was seen as a profession for men, and not very many female clerks. But I feel like the female clerks are really important as well in terms of helping women at the bar who are barristers as well, because I feel like, you know, when I get to that point as well, I'd feel much more comfortable talking to a female clerk than talking to a male clerk about that, and even talking about sort of feeling at that time of the month and you're feeling a bit rough and you're like, oh, can I have some paperwork next Friday because I know I'm going to be feeling terrible. I'd much rather do that with a female clerk than a male clerk, which again comes down to just perception, I suppose, and in your own feeling of, oh gosh, I don't want to be judged for that, and I don't want to feed into the whole women and their hormones sort of narrative.
I've said to you before, Patricia, you talk about the menopause as if you've gone through the other side of it, so I take a lot of comfort from that.
From drugs, can I just say?
I'm not far off, I'm scared.
Irene, do you have any words of wisdom for any women who are thinking of going to the bar?
Oh wow, words of wisdom, put me on the spot. Any women who are going to the bar, just reach out and ask first. I think if you have any apprehensions or if you have any fears, there will always be someone somewhere that will help you. I think the inns of court are really important. And yeah, I think as Laura said, just see if there are people around. There are lots of mentoring sort of initiatives around. So not to be scared, to seek those things out, because they are there, they're increasing a lot. But as Laura's saying, you know, I think there is the onus on us to give back and go to schools, and bar courses too late. And I think, I remember when I was at bar school, it's funny how things happen in a circle. I ended up doing, purely by accident, one of these initiatives around taking young kids from deprived areas in London, taking them into court, and it was actually spearheaded by Simon Reedhead, who is our now joint head of Chambers. Yeah. And so it was through the inn. They asked me if I wanted to get involved, and so I did. So and you know, that the kids from there were, you know, it was a mixed bag, and it was lots of girls as well were there, and they were interested, and so it wasn't, you know, it was boys and girls, and they seemed really, really interested in everything. So I think if I had to speak to someone at 15 or 21 thinking about it, I would just say, you know, don't be scared, go for it. But you know, look for people that can help you. There's lots of stuff out there, and if you just get on a Google search, you know, the Inns of Court have lots of mentoring schemes and initiatives, and chambers like Deco, I think, you know, we're great as well at doing things like that. As I said, you know, that was something I did right at the beginning before I even qualified. Turned out it was our head of chambers that was leading that initiative. But things like that, I think looking for things like that and getting yourself into, you know, the sort of the in through the doors, many pupilages, as many as you can, I think are great, because you will find people who will support you. And even, you know, I really want to get involved in these things, and I think there's lots of people, lots of juniors are really interested in getting involved and helping each other. And so I think, that was a long sort of answer, but you put me on the spot there.
I did put you on the spot. Do any of our other panelists have some either words of wisdom to offer people thinking of coming to the bar, or general observations on how much things have improved for women over the last, well, however long we've all been at the bar?
Things that I feel like I'm sort of banging the drum of things are so wonderful now, and I think the drum is more, things are so much better than they were, you know, when I was doing pupillage, not in this chambers, but, you know, one of my friends at pupil was told, dear, you might want to think about not looking so monkish, perhaps some shorter skirts. And, you know, if that happened now, there would be an immediate complaint to the E&D committee. People would be coming down on that member of chambers like a ton of bricks. There would be an apology, and there would be education. So, you know, that is the change, and it's really important not to lose sight of that. The more of us who do this, the easier it gets. You know, we've got 2 female silks now. It's not enough. That's 2 out of 13. You know, but it's change and it's progress, and they are now banging the drum for further progress. So don't be put off by the statistics. You can do it. And actually, I mean, as I've said, I have found to my very great surprise that the bar's turned out to be, for me, a hugely flexible option. And it's allowed me to have a really great work-life balance. So, yes, also don't be put off by the stereotypes.
That's a very encouraging thing to end on. I think we're almost at the end of our time, unless any one of you wants to say, is desperate to say something else.
I just want to say, being female is a superpower, and to control us, they make out that all our characteristics are weaknesses, but they're absolutely not. The world would not function without women in any sector. So I'm done with feeling it's a negative. It is absolute superpower. You're all fantastic women. The women in chambers are incredible. I know this all sounds like I've suddenly taken some, happy juice, but it really just annoys me. Women do so much, in senior positions throughout the world, and they do it well. And so we should just be proud about it. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Louise. That's really encouraging. And also a positive thing to end on. I can't see any questions, but if anyone listening has a question, then I'm sure we would all be very happy to receive questions by email. Were questions sent in advance? I'm just trying to see whether any questions were sent in advance. What I will do is I will have a look, and if there are questions sent in advance, we will email in answer to those questions. But it's been absolutely great having some people to listen to us. And thank you so much to our 4 panelists. It's been really interesting hearing about your experiences of the bar. So yes, that concludes this session. And please do join us again for another webinar in the future.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thanks, Susanna.
Bye.